You're listening to Moon Monkey. On this episode, I'll be discussing Viceroy's House, directed by Gurinda Chada. So, Viceroy's House tells the story of the last Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten, and his duty in handing over India to the first Indian government. So, after 300 years of British rule, India is on the verge of gaining their independence from Britain. The main problem with this independence movement is due to the diverse population of Sikhs, Hindus and Muslims in the country. There's the potential for a lot of violence and bloodshed and division amongst the population once it's handed back into rule. The British had essentially partitioned off regions or controlled various regions separately or independently. So the problem now is bringing this country back together and uniting it is going to cause tension and violence. The film itself follows two stories. The first one is Lord Mountbatten and his family, and the second one is following members of the Indian staff. In particular, there's a young Hindu man named Jeet Kumar and a young Muslim woman named Alia who are working in the Viceroy's house. They have a romantic relationship, but obviously in a sort of Romeo and Juliet style manner, coming from different religions, there's obviously going to be problems ahead for that relationship. So as the film progresses, we learn that a Muslim leader named Jinnah is pushing for a new country to be created called Pakistan, which will essentially mean partitioning the country of India and having a Muslim state Pakistan, and India, which is going to be for the Hindus and Sikhs. One of the great things about this film, there were some great performances here. Hugh Bonneville is playing Lord Mountbatten with that kind of stiff upper lip British nobility. Gillian Anderson is playing his wife, and we see that his wife cares a lot about the Indian staff of the Viceroy's house, and also they're portrayed very favourably, I think. And one of the things that I'll get on to talk about, people have complained that the film may be, sugarcoating things for the audience, because obviously British rule is not seen by everyone as a great thing. But in this film, it doesn't really get into the idea that it was a negative. So they do great performances, and they're shown as quite caring, and they really do worry about what's going to happen to India after it's handed back, and the violence. They're not just hand it back and they don't care. There were some great performances also from Huma Qureshi, who plays Alia, and Manish Dayal, who plays Jeet Kumar. Their performances really carried most of the film, because their relationship is essentially a metaphor for what's happening to India. These are two people who love each other very much, but they're about to be torn apart because their country, they're both Indians at this point, but their country is going to be separated into India and Pakistan. So there's the potential that they'll essentially become neighbours or even rivals because their countries are going to separate. So theirs is kind of a relationship which represents the relationship of millions of other people across this country. One of the kind of standout performances was Gandhi. The man who played Gandhi in the film was really good. Obviously, he's held in very high regard in Indian society, so he's played as this almost kind of godlike figure who just comes in and is the voice of reason. Obviously, people don't really take his advice and don't listen to him, but he's portrayed as kind of very wise and intelligent, and also has a lot of funny lines, just a kind of very likable, humorous character. The film does offer a good overview of what happened at that period in history. It's not something that I knew terribly much about, so I'm thankful to the film for that. It does explain who the main players were, essentially what was going on. So you find out who Lord Mountbatten was, who Jinnah was, the Muslim League, why they partitioned Pakistan, the reasons they gave for partitioning Pakistan, and then later in the film you discover this sort of the hidden truth, I guess, behind why they partitioned Pakistan and what was in it for the British in doing that. There's no real villains in the film. If there were, I would say it's possibly the people who want to divide the country. so Jinnah. But obviously, depending on your religious affiliations, you might see him as a hero because that was the person who led to the birth of the Muslim nation of Pakistan. Also, Churchill is kind of shown as a little bit of a schemer, I suppose, in a way. But again, you could also see him as being very forward thinking. He could see what was going to happen with the Soviet Union, which led to his working out this plan for partitioning Pakistan. One of the things the film has been accused of is sugarcoating things, and that was my main problem with the film. It does refer to newspaper reports where there were massacres going on, there were huge numbers of people being killed. At the end of the film, it says 1 million people were killed, and you do see news footage of people starving, like briefly, very briefly. But the main issue here is none of the main characters really end up in any kind of danger or violence, or involved in anything particularly traumatic, other than kind of just a tension between them that you see between the Muslims and the Sikhs and Hindus. So I can understand why they wanted to do this, to keep the film accessible and keep the ratings down. They don't want it just blood and gore everywhere and really violent. But personally, I feel like they missed an opportunity to show the horror of religious and nationalistic fervor and intolerance and the real kind of pain and suffering that people went through because of essentially politicians and governments tearing this country apart on religious grounds, or dividing people on religious grounds. So at the end of the film, you kind of feel, yeah, it was a sad story, but you haven't really got that emotional, heart-rending sense of this was a real tragedy. One of the things, on a similar note, that I found surprising about the film was the length. It's a fairly short film. From the trailers, you would think that this film is going to be like a 3 or 4 hour epic, because you've got so many stories to tell here of Mountbatten and his family, of all the religious groups that are in India, all the political leaders, all the kind of ramifications this has for the wider world. But it actually managed to keep this down to a really short runtime and get across a lot of information subtly. It does lead at points to them using a lot of expository dialogue where people will have really unusual conversations where they're explaining the literacy rates of India or politics or what's going on in a way that's somewhat unnatural, and you can't imagine these characters really having this. You can tell that that's for your benefit, so you're understanding what's going on. But the best thing about the film is it does encourage you to go away and find out a little more about what happened and why India was partitioned and what the religious tensions were. But in this film, I thought more could have been done to really kind of hit you with the impact and the importance of what was happening here. So I'd recommend this film to anyone who's interested in the history of that period. It could possibly be accused of airbrushing things a little bit or being over sentimental, especially in the final scenes. Not to give too much away, but rather than ending on a down note, it sort of ends on an upbeat, uplifting note, which you think is somewhat not fitting considering the tragedy and the suffering that people are going through, to end on that kind of note of joy. But I suppose the director maybe wanted it to be an uplifting, a sense that there's still hope and there's still light and love. So again, that's just perhaps a matter of taste. But yeah, I would definitely recommend this film if you're interested in the period. So that was my review of Viceroy's House. Thanks for listening. Remember to like and subscribe. We'll be back with another episode of the Moon Monkey podcast very shortly.